Good morning, class. Today is Thursday, March 26th. This is the lecture, should have been recorded yesterday, March 25th. The lecture is on the United States foreign policy in the Middle East, basically up through the presidency of President Reagan. So I'm hoping you are able to see the first lecture. I hope it all came through pretty clear, as I said then, I think, but I'll repeat it. If you have questions about the content of the lecture, please send them to me, and if they're good, I'll share them with the class next time. So the main thrust of this lecture is to see how the United States, or to explain how the United States foreign policy toward the Middle East evolved over the 20th century. And so to begin with, as I mentioned earlier, the Middle East was not an area where the United States had imperial interest in the late 19th, early 20th century. Our interests were directed primarily to Latin America, and then after the Spanish-American War, to the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba. The United States had an active interventionist policies in the history of the Caribbean countries, so everything around the Caribbean basin, both the islands, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, but also on the coast, Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador. So we had interest in the Caribbean, but we didn't really think much about the Middle East. Our main interest in the Middle East before World War I was missionaries. The American missionaries were quite active in the region, Protestant missionaries. There were almost no American Catholic missionaries in the Middle East. The Catholic missions were conducted largely from France. But American Protestant missionaries are very important in setting up educational institutions. Most important are Robert College in Istanbul, and then what would be known later as the American University in Beirut. But there were other smaller institutions. There was one that was Catholic. There was a Jesuit university in Baghdad, and then there were various other schools, American School in Cairo, and so on. And that had a very important, those had a very important role in molding Arab elites, because not only did the Christian young men and women go to these institutions, but also increasingly Muslims from the elite families did. So America had a disproportionate influence on the molding of the intellectual life of the Arab Middle East in the early 20th century. That said, our real interest then grew in oil, and starting in 1936, Standard Oil California, or SoCal as its abbreviation, got exclusive rights to look for oil in Saudi Arabia. They discovered it, and by the World War II, Saudi Arabia was already online producing oil. And so America's relationship with Saudi Arabia was very intense, very close, both financially and militarily and politically. Saudi Arabia for many years had no diplomatic relation with any country other than the United States. All right, so we come out of the World War II, and the United States is now faced as a global power, and its main competitor is the Soviet Union. And so what the strategy of the United States was in this period was so-called containment. That is, not allowing communism to spread outside of the regions it already was. And remember, the big shock to the United States had come in 1949 when the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And so containment was the major ideology that the US had. And so we saw that then, I mentioned earlier, the Eisenhower Doctrine, which is the first time the United States gets directly involved in the Middle East, although you could say it's only on the borders of the Middle East, because what had happened is in Greece during the Second World War, the most active opposition to the Nazi occupation were the communists. And when the Germans withdrew from Greece in 1945, the Greek Communist Party took over most of Greece, and then the British intervened to try to return the Greek monarch, who had been in Britain during the war, to return him to his throne. And Greece then entered into a prolonged period of civil war that lasted from 1945 to 1949. Now, the British were increasingly incapable of being able to supply the royalists in Greece because of the problems in India, Palestine, various other places. So increasingly, the United States took up that burden of defending the Greek monarchy against the communists. And so Truman then issued what was known as the Truman Plan. And the Truman Plan said basically that any country that felt threatened by Soviet expansion could ask for United States military and economic aid. And so Greece signed on to this. The royalist government in Greece signed on to this, as did Turkey. And Turkey was worried about the Russian expansion through the straits, through which are Istanbul zone, and also the Soviet involvement in Iran, which we had talked about earlier, and I'll come back to in just a minute. So Turkey also joins, and the United States then opens up basically some military aid to Turkey, and definitely closer discussions. The other country involved in the containment and what was known as the Northern Tier was Iran. I mentioned in the lecture on Iran that the United States was very active in supporting the royal government, the Shah's government, against these the two smaller communist states that had been established in Iran. One, the Republic of Azerbaijan, and the other the Mahabad Republic. The Mahabad Republic was the Kurdish Republic. Azerbaijan was the Azeri ethnic group. Remember, the Azeris are a Turkic people. That is, they speak a language very closely related to Turkish, spoken in Turkey. But they were Shia Muslims in Azerbaijan, in the Iranian Azerbaijan. So the U.S. helped Iran put down those two rebellions. And there's a kind of a interesting backstory in the Mahabad Republic, because the head of the Mahabad Republic, or I'm not sure if he's the head or the second, it was a man named Mustafa Barzani. That's Barazani, a Kurdish leader originally from actually Iraq, who had gone into, during World War II, had gone into Iran and helped with the creation of this socialist state in northwestern Iran. When his rebellion, or when the state collapsed with the help by the royalist forces came in, the Shah's army came in, he fled to Moscow. And he was in Moscow for, I think close to 10 years, if not longer. And then eventually he returned to Iraq. Now, why I just threw him in here is because he emerges during our involvement with the Kurds against the Iraqi government. He and his group are our main allies. So it's kind of interesting that a guy that started off as a ally of the Soviet Union and enemy of the United States ended up being an ally of the United States. In fact, he was buried. He came to America during one of the Saddam Hussein's suppression of the Kurds. He came to America and died in New Jersey, was buried there, and was only returned to the Kurdish autonomous region in northern Iraq after the 2003 war. So that's just one of those really strange footnotes of Middle Eastern history. So the United States then interest, we'll say, in post-war is obviously in oil, and it's obviously in containment of the Soviet Union. The new element that enters in, starting, we mentioned this, I mentioned this in earlier lectures, starting with the Biltmore Conference, is that the United States starts to have an interest in Israel. And this is a very unusual case in the United States because it is one of the few countries in the world, and maybe the only country in the world, where a foreign policy issue is a domestic policy issue. That is, a large number of Americans, initially Jewish Americans, but over the years, Protestant fundamentalist Americans have been just as much in support of Israel as the Jewish population. So it is an issue that people can vote on. And so Congress is aware of that, and increasingly Congress became more and more pro-Israeli. It wasn't initially. The United States did vote for the partition plan in 1947. The United States put pressure on a number of non-aligned countries, most notably Panama and Liberia, to vote in favor of partition. But the United States didn't supply Israel in the war for its war for independence. That was major supplier was France, and ironically, the Soviet Union. Soviet Union supplied Israel through its proxy state, Czechoslovakia, which was under the communist rule. And when the United States recognized Israel in 1948, it was followed immediately by the Soviet Union. And so Israel from the beginning had a kind of a, remember, because the labor Zionist party and movement in Israel. Israel was seen by many in the West, especially during the Eisenhower, which was a very conservative period in United States history, was seen as being potentially pro-Soviet. And so America did not get involved that much other than private money. Private money from Jewish philanthropic societies poured into Israel. But in terms of government, federal money, there was very little going to Israel. And the Americans kind of kept a few steps back away from Israel. And we saw that in 56. In 56, when the Israelis got together with the French and the British to invade Egypt, the United States really did not know it was coming. And as a result, the United States voted for the UN resolution that called for the withdrawal of British, French, and Israeli forces from Sinai. And the United States really does not get that directly involved in Israel until the 1967, the aftermath of the 67 war. And I'll come to that in just a minute. So our interests then in the 50s in the Middle East were largely focused on Iran and Turkey. Now, during the Korean War, which started in 1950, the Americans put together the United Nations response. And this is one of the strange events in Cold War history, why the Soviets didn't veto this. It's not, they didn't. I mean, they should have probably in their interest. They did not veto the formation of United Nations forces. So American forces went in to help the Republic of Korea, South Korea, with the United Nations mandate. And so although the United States bore the brunt of the fighting along with the South Korean allies, the Turks and the Greeks both sent troops to Korea. Turks, many more than Greeks. And the Turks fought actually with a great deal of valor. The American army from that point on has had a close relationship with the Turkish military in good times and bad times. They've been very close. And both countries, Greece and Turkey, then joined NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So although they're in the Eastern Mediterranean, they belong to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So they are fully incorporated into the Western anti-communist military alliance. As I mentioned earlier, Iran never joined that. Instead, we formed with Britain the basically the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO, CENTO. And that was United States, Britain, Iran, Pakistan, and originally it was going to be Iraq, but the revolution in Iraq in 1958 took Iraq out of that. And the initial name for the CENTO agreement was the Baghdad Pact. So that even shows that Iraq was considered a major part. So the British interest was in maintaining the monarchies that were favorable to Britain, most notably Iraq, but also then Kuwait, the Gulf states, Egypt up until the 1953 war. And that's probably one of the reasons the British were so anti-Nasser, is Nasser had eliminated with his revolution. King Farouk had been more or less willing to go along with what the British wanted. So Americans really still didn't have that much of a direct interest in the Middle East other than oil. And until Kennedy came to power. And Kennedy came to power in 1960. And again, with the Democrats, you get a much more emphasis on human rights and spreading of democracy. So Kennedy comes in and makes a very forceful statement about Algeria, which was undergoing a civil war that had started in 1954. Algeria wasn't considered by France to be a colony. They had Morocco and Tunisia were both considered colonies. And they had been given independence in 1956. Algeria remained under French rule because France had incorporated it as part of France. And the European population of Algeria, which was a little over 1 million out of a population of about 10 million, was of partial French ancestry, more Italians and Spanish and Portuguese than French, actually. But they were all French citizens. All the Europeans were French French citizens. The Muslim population of Algeria could only become French citizens if they gave up Sharia. They had to say that they would not be bound by Sharia law. They would be bound only by French civil law. And so very few, in the tens of thousands, only Muslim Algerians were French citizens. By contrast, the Jewish population, which was very small, about 50,000, they had all become French citizens. So they were considered the same as French, and they had the right to vote for members of French parliament. So the Algerian Revolution had been going on since '54 and had gotten quite bloody. The French were in the upper hand by 1960. There had been a Battle of Algiers, which was made famous by a movie. If you have time, you might want to watch that over your isolation. Very pro-Algerian independence movie made by Italian Pontecorvo. But that had died down, and the guerrilla war had moved into the countryside, and the French were pretty much winning it. But in 1960, or I think it was 61, Kennedy made a speech where he said that Algeria should be independent. And that really caught the French. Charles de Gaulle, who was the president, caught him by surprise. They caught the French by surprise. They were a member of NATO. And at that point, French attitudes toward NATO changed very sour. And they, in fact, kicked the NATO that we had. There had been American troops stationed in France. As a part of NATO, they had to withdraw from France. It stayed in NATO, but it stayed from that point on. France starts to see itself as a very different player in the Middle East than the United States, with different interest. At this point, it is supporting Israel. So Israel is able to get arms from France, including the most sophisticated jet fighters the French were making, the Phantom jets. And France also helped Israel develop its atomic bomb. So France was the major player for Israel in international relations. The United States supported it generally in the United Nations, but it wasn't financially, it wasn't that committed to Israel, other than private connections continued quite strong. So the other thing that Kennedy did, as we talked about Iran, is he put pressure on Iran to institute the White Revolution. And that then set off a whole chain of events that would eventually lead to the Iranian Revolution. But we'll come to that. We've already spoken about that, and I'll come back to that in this lecture in a minute. So then, for most of starting about 66, the American, earlier even, but because in the 64 election was between Barry Goldwater, the Republican, and Lyndon Johnson, who had been the vice president under Kennedy and then become the president. The campaign in 64 was largely about Vietnam. Goldwater wanted a very aggressive American policy in Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese government against North Vietnam. He even advocated bombing Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, and he lost by a landslide. And so Johnson came in, but found that he was sucked into the war because the only way out would have been just to walk away, and they didn't really want to walk away. So by 66 and on, America is consumed in our foreign policy with Vietnam. So this leads, go back to the Middle East, we did, as I mentioned in the lecture earlier, we helped make Resolution 242 possible. Remember, that says that Israel will withdraw from lands occupied during the 67 war in return for peace and recognition with all the Arab states surrounding it. Israel agreed to that because it said lands and not the lands. And so that left open the door. At that point, the labor Zionists were in power. And I think for most of them, they did not want to keep the West Bank and definitely did not want to keep the Gaza Strip. So their intentions of saying lands meant that they could keep East Jerusalem, including the holy city of Jerusalem, the walled city of Jerusalem. They weren't going to give that up. The Arab states all rejected it. And so what you had then is a continuation really of the 67 war, in that starting in 69, the Egyptian government started shelling the Israelis on the other side of the Suez Canal. This led to a massive escalation. The Soviets increasingly were drawn into Egypt. It's rumored I don't know if it's proven or not, but it's definitely rumored that the pilots flying the MiGs that were engaging the Israeli jets in dogfights over the canal were flown by Soviet pilots. Whether that's true or not, the Soviet influence was huge, began to be very palpable, numbers of Soviets who were in Egypt. And I'll come to that in a minute because I arrived in Egypt in 72 when they were still there. But the result of that was that the Israelis basically flattened the Egyptian cities which were on the eastern side of the canal. So those cities of Port Suez, Ismailia, they were leveled. It was gradual bombing of those cities so that most of the civilian population actually got out. So there wasn't that many civilian casualties. But if you look at the films of those cities, they look like, like Aleppo or one of the cities in Syria today that have been completely destroyed by the fighting. So that led the president of Egypt to rethink his options. And this is the key. I'm going to make my main point of this lecture is that the 1973 war is the major turning point in a whole number of ways in the United States policy toward the Middle East. And it stayed a key part of our policy, I would say, until 2001. And 2001, which I'll talk about later lecture, that's when we start to we don't worry about the Soviets anymore, we worry about Islamic extremism. But we weren't worrying about Islamic extremism even after the Iranian Revolution. It wasn't on the radar of most American strategic thinkers. All right, so Anwar Sadat was chosen by Nasser to be his successor before he died. He named him publicly so that there wouldn't be any fight in the transition from his rule to his successor. And the joke among everybody, diplomats, Egyptians, everybody, is that Nasser picked Sadat because he thought him to be the least likely to stage a coup against him while he was still alive. In other words, he was the kind of the lazy general. But he proved to be pretty shrewd. He was a son of a peasant, so he is from the southern part of Egypt. And so physically he is African looking, much more African looking than most Egyptians. And that he suffered that in his career. And he considered himself to be a man of the people in the same way that Nasser had considered himself to be a man of the people. But he made a calculation. He said that, well, the Soviets cannot give us peace. What I want, Egypt wants, is peace with Israel. So this is a dramatic break with the Nasserist idea that Egypt is the cornerstone of the United Arab Front against Israel. And Sadat began to think of Egypt as Egypt. And in his, after the 73 war, for example, they dropped the name United Arab Republic and they just become the Arab Republic of Egypt. So Egypt becomes the important part and then the Arab part drops out. It's just the Republic of Egypt. So he wants an Egypt first policy. And so he calculates that the only way he can do that is to win the United States support. And so he plans for the 1973 war. And one of the things he does is the summer of 72, that's when I arrived in Egypt, he orders all of the Soviets out of Egypt. And there's estimates there were at least 50,000. I know, I lived in an apartment block in central Cairo, so I could see them. They were going to the gold market to convert their Egyptian pounds into gold to leave, and they just vanished overnight. And, well, not overnight, but say within a couple of weeks, they were all gone. And why he did this, he wanted to show the United States that this was not a Soviet plan, the war that was going to come, and that he was doing it without Soviet advisors, that this was an Egyptian operation mounted by Egyptians, planned by Egyptians. So with that in mind, and you have to remember the United States is still at this time trying to get out of Vietnam. With Nixon, you have, some would say diabolical, some would say very intelligent. You have one of the most astute statesmen the Americans had in the 20th century, and that's Kissinger. And Kissinger had been negotiating with the Vietnamese for the withdrawal of the American troops when the 73 war broke out. So the Egyptians launched the attack on Yom Kippur. So by the Israelis called it the Yom Kippur War. It also happened during the holy month of Ramadan. So the Muslims, Arabs call it the Ramadan War. I like to be neutral, so I just call it the 73 War. And I'd like to point out, we talked about which wars are legitimate, which wars are illegitimate. So the 56 invasion of Egypt by Britain, France, and Israel was illegitimate by international law. The Israeli invasion of Egypt in 67 was legitimated by international law because the Egyptians had closed the very strategic Straits of Tiran, and about half of you misspelled that on your quiz or your midterm. I didn't count it off. You spelled it Tehran, like the capital of Iran. It's Tiran, so Tiran. So just like Iran with a T in front of it. But anyway, the Egyptians had closed that strait, and under international law, that should have been open to Israeli shipping. So it was an active war, although they technically were already at war. They had been at war since 48, but there had been a truce. But they were technically, the Israelis then had the legal right under international law to invade Egypt in 67. And similarly, the Egyptians in 73 have international laws on their side because they are not actually invading Israel, are they? They're crossing over the canal into territory that was Egyptian, that was illegally occupied by Israel under international law. So they had the green light, although it really didn't matter at this point. So they cross, and it's an amazing victory because the Israelis had not expected it. They had a major, this is the date, October the 6th, 1973. I was living in Cairo at the time as well. So I have a lot of stories that I won't share with you about living in Cairo during the three-week-long 73 war. The Egyptians had been practicing dropping pontoon bridges in the desert so that they could keep the bridges going, so they could get the troops over the canal quicker than the Israelis could blow them up. The second thing they had done, which was very ingenious and very Egyptian, is they had sent frogmen over with basically mud. The Israelis, the fortified line was called the Bar Lev line, BAR-LEV, named after an Israeli defense minister. It was sort of like the Maginot Line in France before World War I. It was a defensive barrier all along the canal and included ducts to shoot napalm into the canal to incinerate any Egyptians who were trying to cross. Well, what the Egyptians did on the night before the invasion is they had sent commandos over, swum across the canal, and then stuck mud in all of the flues for the napalm. And according later, we find out documentation that the Israelis had discovered one of them had been stopped up with mud, discovered one, and they just assumed that it was natural silt. And so they didn't check the others. And so that meant that very effective weapon, which could have incinerated the entire Egyptian army, wasn't used, couldn't be used. So the Egyptians cross, and they're able to take out the Israeli tanks. Amazingly, they have gotten new weapons from the Russians. This is something that are still in use by American army. It was a new device. Instead of a bazooka, like the old-fashioned, like you might have seen in World War II movies, what you now have is a rocket that you shoot off. Just one man can carry it, and then you have a joystick, almost like a computer game, and you direct the rocket at your target. Now, the disadvantage for the attacking army is that the soldier has to stay in visual, has to be able to see the tank in order to direct the rocket. So that made the soldiers vulnerable, but they were very effective, and they took out well over 100 Israeli tanks in the first day. And that was so many that the Americans had to scramble and send American tanks from NATO bases in Germany to supply the Israeli army. The air power was also put off a bit because they had new anti-jet. Not that many planes were shot down by the Egyptians, but they created a scary zone for the Israeli pilots because they had these ground-to-air missiles that they had bought or supplied by the Soviet Union. And they were also very effective. So it was, the first part of the war was really a land battle, unlike the 67 war, which had been pretty much an air battle, and that's what Israel had the upper hand. So in the initial few days of the war, it's a Egyptian victory. they're pushed in. They overrun the Bar-Lev line, and at the same time, Syria has invaded the Israel had occupied the Golan Heights in what had been Syrian territory in the '67 war, and Syria, in coordination with Egypt, had invaded the same day, had crossed over into the Golan Heights and attacking the Israelis. So it looked pretty bad for Israel. In fact, at one point, being in Egypt, we were listening to everybody's radio, and the BBC came on about 10 days into the war and said that they were no longer accepting the Israeli military communiques about the fighting because they were lying, whereas the Egyptians were telling the truth. And Egyptians were so shocked by that because they were so used to their own media lying to them all the time, they just couldn't believe that the Egyptian media was actually telling the truth. But what they then did, and this is scandal, instead of pushing on toward Tel Aviv, which they could have, having defeated the main front line of the Israeli army or overrun it, they could have pushed on toward Tel Aviv, but they stopped 10 miles in. And what that calculation was that Sadat, or we, Egypt, show that we have the military ability to inflict great casualties on the Israelis. The Israelis had been, after the '67 war and in '56 war too, had become convinced that the Arabs posed no military threat to them whatsoever, so there was no need to negotiate with them. Egypt wanted to say, yes, we are the weaker of the two parties, but we can still inflict major damage on you unless we get a peace treaty. And eventually the Israelis were able to counterattack, and this was led by Ariel Sharon, who we'll talk about later. I already mentioned him actually in the Lebanon lecture. So Ariel Sharon, Sharon, he'll be one of the terms because he eventually will become prime minister of Israel. Ariel Sharon leads the attack that crosses over the canal. So when the ceasefire is finally brokered at the end of October, there is Egyptian forces on the Sinai, in the Sinai Peninsula, the northern part, and there are Israeli forces across the canal in Egypt proper. So the negotiations is for disengagement, and so both sides withdraw to where they are. And this is then where Kissinger comes in. He comes and starts flying back and forth between Tel Aviv and Cairo, and eventually he's able to broker more and more of a ceasefire, although Nixon is defeated largely because of Watergate, or he has to resign because of Watergate. And so there is a hold on it until 1976 when Carter is elected. But it did accomplish something. Nixon, in fact, went to Egypt before he had to resign. So he visited China and he visited Egypt, and he restored diplomatic relations with Egypt. And so there was a clear sign that things were changing. Now you have to remember, we're already talking about Lebanon. I mentioned Lebanon. Lebanese Civil War starts in '75. And so Carter comes into power in '76, and being a Democrat, he's very much for peace, human rights, all these kinds of things. He enters in to negotiate with the two parties, Israel and Egypt. It is made more difficult because in 1970, here you have to look at your notes. You have to look at your sheet. I think I have it marked there. 77 or 78, Menachem Begin comes to power for the first time. So he represents the revisionist group. It's the first time the revisionists hold the prime ministership in Israel. Remember, he had been part of the revisionist underground against the British, and also originally had a problem with the Israeli state. But his party, which was then called Herut and later would become Likud, comes to power, and so he's not. I don't really want to give up any territory. So it stalled, and then Sadat does a second big gamble. He flies to Israel. He basically just gets in a plane, a military plane, and flies to Israel. And The Israelis are kind of shocked, but they don't want to shoot him down. And then he shows up and he says he wants to address the Israeli parliament. So he goes to Jerusalem and he addresses the Israeli parliament. And he says, I want peace. This is in, I forget, it's fall. I can remember. I was back in graduate school and watched it on TV. I want peace with Israel. Put up or shut up, Israel. You say you want peace. We want peace. And so Carter then puts together the Camp David discussions between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. They eventually come to a conclusion that is then signed in 79. And under that agreement, Egypt declares peace with Israel, full diplomatic relations with Israel. Israel can use the Suez Canal. And Israel says it will withdraw all of its settlements from the Sinai, because by this time there were settlements, civilian settlements in Sinai, northern part on the Mediterranean. And that was a challenge for Begin because he was a hardliner, and the hardliners didn't want to give up anything to Arabs. But he was helped by this, by the religious establishment that by this time there's a strong religious Zionist movement in Israel that supports the revisionist, and they want to keep the West Bank. Now, they want to keep the West Bank not because it's strategic reasons, but because that was the land given to the Israelis by God. And so that's when you start to hear these names. Instead of you can tell almost when you talk to an Israeli or listen to an Israeli politician, you can pretty much tell where he or she stands on the political spectrum. If he or she refers to either the West Bank or occupied territories, they are labor Zionist. If they say Shechem and Judea and Samaria, Judea and Samaria, so Judea, Samaria, Samaria. Judea is the southern part of the West Bank, where the town of Hebron is, Havron for the Israelis. And the northern part is where the town of Nablus is, or Shechem to the Israelis. So those are now called Judea and Samaria, which means they're ours. Now, the irony of this is that biblical Israel never extended to Tel Aviv. This is something Israeli archaeologists have pretty much proved conclusively. So, yes, we can have the West Bank, but if we're really going by what God gave us, then we have to give up Tel Aviv and Haifa. So there's an inconsistency, but then almost every political group, there's an inconsistency. But he's able to get the rabbis back to my wandering here. He's able to get the rabbis to back the withdrawal of the troops, of the settlements from Sinai, because that was not biblical Israel. So there is a peace treaty. Egypt is shunned by the Arab nations. Almost every Arab nation breaks off diplomatic relations. Egyptian workers who had been working in Arabia, Kuwait, various places, were forced to return back home. It suffered a real economic thing, although the Saudis technically were breaking with them, but they really weren't. They were continuing to fight. But part of the agreement, the United States agreed to bring military and economic aid to Israel. Congress voted it, although it was voted by Congress that it would always be only a third of what Israel got. Now, here lately, it's much less than that. But through most of the rest of the 20th century, for every dollar that Egypt got, Israel got 3. But Egypt still got a substantial number of money from the United States during that period. All right, so that's where we'll go up until I forgot the other. The other major part of the 73 War. This is the part that I didn't tell. And I think I actually recorded this lecture yesterday, and I realized I didn't stop it, and I had the second lecture, and then so you would have seen yesterday's lecture plus about a 30-minute break of silence in this backdrop of my bookshelf, and then you would have seen another lecture was totally irrelevant to what you're learning. So what I didn't put in that, and which I did put in here, and I also noticed I put in my key questions to you about the 73 War, is that one of the things that the Arab oil-producing states did is they embargoed the United States. Now, OPEC, the Association of Petroleum Exporting Countries, had been created in the late 60s. The Arabs had created their own OPEC, so OA. Organization of Arab Oil Exporting countries rather. And the Arab countries then embargoed the United States because of the United States supplying of Israel. And so no oil was coming to the United States. And interestingly, in this embargo, Iran agreed to go along with it. And Iran then, we thought it was one of our best allies. But what the Shah calculated was that he's going to get a whole lot more revenue. And just to give you a sense of what happened, oil prices, which had been holding more or less steady in the 1960s to around $2 a barrel. Now, if you were the inflation, what is that in your money, 2020 money? It would be about $20, $25 a barrel. It jumped from $2 a barrel to $20 a barrel because of the embargo. And that meant oil prices all over the world. Because remember, the United States was still getting about half of our oil at this point from the Middle East. And it had an impact on oil everywhere. And so think about it. It would have gone from, if $2 was $20, $20 to be $400 in 2020 money. And there were gas shortages. There were lines everywhere. I was in Egypt, so I luckily missed all that. But one of the lasting impacts is American universities changed their calendars. It used to be that universities would close down for a Christmas break and then open up in January, and then have their maybe a week or two classes and then exams. Then you'd have a week break between fall and spring semester, and then you'd come back to school. So they decided they'd just be closed for like 6 weeks or 5 weeks in some places, and that would save money on their heating bills. And so that's why we have the semesters the way we have them now, is all part of this. But it also meant that there were large amounts of money were pouring into Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia used that money to buy out the American Standard Oil California's stock. And so after the oil embargo, Aramco, which had been a joint American-Saudi company, became entirely a Saudi company. And this year they had planned to have been almost entirely owned by the Saudi royal family. And this year they had talked about opening up for stock, and it didn't get off to, partly because of various crises. And so eventually we expect it will be being traded on the stock market. But from 73 on, it then is the money of, it's the Saudi, it's only Saudi. And the king at that time was King Faisal ibn Saud. He was one of the stronger kings they had, and he also was more of a nationalist, Arab nationalist. So he was willing to use the money, one, to help the Palestinians, and other what he thought were nationalist causes. So there was a drift then between Saudi Arabia and the United States in the 70s. Okay, so we covered that. All right, so that then with Carter, you get the Iranian Revolution, and that it basically ends his career, because although there was also economic downturn, but for well over 100 days, we had on our television, well, actually more than over a year, actually. We had no, it wasn't a year, 79. So it was, it was over a year. So the election in 1980 was all during the election campaigns, which is Ronald Reagan versus Jimmy Carter. The Republicans were drumming up of the fact that Carter had been ineffective in getting the release of the American hostages. That was one of the issues. The other issue then is the invasion. Iraq invades Iran in the summer of 1980. And so Iran is at war with Iraq, and the United States is trying to get its hostages out. Now, there was the botched attempt to free the hostages. The Americans landed planes in western Iran and were going to rush to Tehran to get the hostages out. But one of the planes crashed, and so it was aborted. The other thing that happened in that same time, time of the Iranian Revolution, 1979, is the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. There had been a communist government that had come to power in Afghanistan, and it was losing a war against the Islamic rebels, the people who today, the ancestors or predecessors of the Taliban. So the religious conservatives are fighting the communist regime, and the Soviets then intervene on the side of the government, the communist government, and then Russian occupation of Afghanistan is a reality. So the United States is faced with this kind of crisis of how to deal with this. So that plays out in the election. As I said, I don't think it's the only issue why Reagan won, because Carter's economy wasn't also not doing very well. But Reagan wins quite well in the election, quite decisively. And interestingly enough, on the day that he is inaugurated is the day that the Ayatollah Khomeini releases the American hostages. So he clearly had a personal animus against Carter and wanted to basically rub, his nose at Carter, say, ha ha ha, now we let the hostages go. Reagan then pursues his policy, and it's his policy, famously, to bring down the Soviet Union. They see the opportunity of the war in Afghanistan as how they phrased it is the Soviet Union's Vietnam. And just as Vietnam had sapped our resources, they were planning that Afghanistan would sap the Soviets. And so they began a policy of supplying the rebels in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And this then brings, we'll talk more about this, the rise of the political Islam. That'll be the next lecture I prepare. That then brings the American and the Saudi interests back together again, because they are containment of communism and the promotion of a political Islam. And I'll talk why the Saudis are changing on that in the next lecture. But it is also Faisal is assassinated, and a weaker king comes to power. So there had been a divergence of Saudi American interest in the 1970s, 1980s because of Afghanistan. They come back together again, and then we get in the midst of this whole troublesome 1980s. We get what I'll close with this, which is one of the more bizarre incidents in Middle East politics, American Middle East relations, and that is what is called Contragate, sometimes called Iran-gate, sometimes called Iran-Contra. So what is it? Well, who are the Contras? That's the first part. Iran, we got a pretty good idea what Iran is. Well, who are the Contras? Well, there had been, in the 1970s, there had been an ongoing guerrilla war against the dictatorship of Somoza, S-A-M-O-Z-A, in Nicaragua. That was called the Sandinistas. They were a leftist popular group named after guerrilla fighter Sandino, who had fought the Americans in the 1930s when America occupied Nicaragua back then. And so they were fighting the government of Somoza, and they eventually won, part because, they win in 79. And who's in power in 79? No, it's Carter. And so under Nixon and the Republicans and then Ford, the Republicans had supported the government of Somoza against the leftist rebels, which was typical for Republicans in that period to support right-wing dictators against leftist populists. Carter didn't. He removed any support for Somoza, and the revolution then gained ground and won. And in 1979, Somoza fled, I think, to Florida. And Daniel Ortega established the Socialist Republic in Nicaragua. And almost immediately, there was a counter-revolution, so in Spanish, contra-revolución. So the Contras comes from contra. The counter-revolutionaries then are largely the National Guard under under Somoza. And they are supported by the Americans. But the Americans have trouble supporting them because the Congress at this point is still largely Democrat. And so there isn't, it's hard for Americans to get support to the Contras. Then they come up with this plan. There had been, during the civil war in Lebanon, and I mentioned the rise of Hezbollah, it was starting with the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon in 78, gained strength in the 80s. it started kidnapping people. All the Palestinians also kidnap people and then hold Westerners, hold them for ransom. But the Hezbollah, which is now being directed, and I'll talk more about this when we talk about the Shia, rise of political Shia, the Hezbollah also has direct contacts with the Iranian government. And so they target Americans. So there are these 9 Americans by 1972 that are imprisoned in Beirut, some of them for not just 2 years by that time. And so Congress votes covertly. So Congress does vote this to send money to pay the ransom. Now, the United States government did not want to pay any ransom to terrorists. That's it's officially what we've said all along. We're still saying it. But what they did is they agreed to supplementary arms shipments to Israel, which weren't controversial. Then the United States made a deal with the Israelis that the Israelis would then ship those arms to Iran. Iran would pay for those arms. That money would then come back to Israel. Israel would turn that money back to the United States. The United States would use that money to free the hostages, which we did. So there's a very complicated money laundering kind of thing going on here. Then in 1975, you have a lieutenant colonel that's in the Security Council, American Security, where we call that, the Reagan's security group. He was a hero from the Vietnam War. He comes up with this idea that, he's not alone. There are conservative financial forces in the United States that are also supporting this, that they will continue to ship these weapons to Iran by Israel, and that they will then use the money not to buy freedom of hostages, but to fund the Contras. So in other words, to buy them guns. And it would all look off the books. It would all look like, well, we don't know where this money's coming from. The first crack happened when one of the Israeli planes crashed in Turkey, and Turkey then opened up to journalists showing the wrecked Israeli planes and the weapons on board that were clearly heading to Iran. And so that broke the whole story, and it was a big scandal. Reagan was able to plead that he never knew what was going on, that it was Ollie North, and so Ollie North kind of fell under the bus and took the blame for what happened. So that was Iran Contragate. So that was one of the most bizarre that I know of. There are probably a lot of them I don't know of, but that was one of the most bizarre bits of American involvement. So here we were sending weapons to a state that we weren't actually at war with, Iran, but we weren't particularly friendly with. And I will talk a little more about the Iran-Iraq war when I talk about American involvement in our war with Iraq. So I'll leave that for another lecture. So we've gone almost to, I think, an hour now. So what I want to do is sum up that the American relations with the Middle East have evolved over the 20th century. As I said in the beginning, it was largely philanthropic. Wilson's plan, 14 points, seemed to promise political independence to the peoples of the Middle East. The people of the Middle East clearly took it that way. The United States generally had a very positive image in the Middle East because of our educational institutions, also because increasingly by the 50s and 60s and 70s, Middle Easterners of elite families who want to get a better education, they come to America. They much prefer coming to America than France or England, both of which have imperialist connotations in those countries. And so the United States is viewed very favorably. As I mentioned earlier, our first other interest, other than philanthropy, is oil, which will remain an interest even now that we are technically self-sufficient in oil. The oil market is still very important to the world economy, and so America is heavily invested in that. And so although we don't take imports from the Middle East, we profit from the oil trade, and so that's still an important element. And then, as I mentioned, after World War II, our idea was containment of the Soviet Union. That lasted all the way through, and I'll talk more about this when we come about Afghanistan, through the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then we're kind of sitting on top of things in the 1990s, and that's when we pushed forward for peace plans between Israel and the Arabs. And again, that would be another lecture. And we then, after 2001, all of a sudden we have a new strategic interest, and that is the containment of political Islam, especially Islamic terrorism. And so that then becomes a crucial issue. All along, after 67, before 67, there was an issue. Support of Israel was an issue for a segment of the American population, but not necessarily for the government itself. As I argued in this lecture, after the 73 war, then it's the state. The American government takes the role of France after the 67 war. Is very disappointed with Israel's continued occupation of the West Bank and Sinai. And so the French basically quit giving military aid to the Israelis. So the Israelis had won the 67 war with Mirage jets, French jets. The 73 war was Phantom jets, so American jets replaced the French. Similarly, they had won the 67 war with French tanks. The American tanks are the ones that are crucial in the 73 war. So in that 67 to 73, France drops out of the equation as supplier of Israel, and America steps in and takes its place. Increasingly then, Israel becomes a political issue, not so much political issue, because pretty much Democrats, Republicans are united on support of Israel and throughout the 20th century. As one Palestinian American said to me, if we had as many Palestinian Americans as there are Jewish Americans, then it would be the other way around. I'm not sure of that, because I think there were a lot of Americans who aren't Jewish, and there are some Jews who are also Christian, obviously, the Israel, although in the early period when Israel, before the militant settlement started, I think most everybody thought that Israel was in the right. I think most everybody, the fact that Israel had accepted 242, I think almost everybody, left and right, in the United States were supporting Israel. It's only more recently that there is a division. But let's just say for general purposes that Israel remains a political issue for the United States. I mean, positive. Americans are positive for Israel. And so that then puts us into, that's another part of the equation that we don't have any other part of the world. I can't think of another country on earth where Americans would vote one way or the other if it were involved in a conflict. So that is an ongoing issue. So I will stop it here. I hope you're well. I hope you're able to watch this. There's no glitches in it. And if you have questions, please email me. I will try. This is going up probably today, Thursday. I will send out a notice when it's ready. After today, I'm not going to send out notices because I think they should be on schedule. So just on every Monday and Wednesday, check your Zoom to see if the lecture has been downloaded. So I'll leave you now. I hope you're staying healthy, safe, and occupied, because I know it must be really difficult not being near a library and not being able to talk with your friends and all that. It must be very tough. And so you have my sympathies for that. And I'll talk to you soon. I'll hopefully be able to get off today. Yes.